We have a panel of three speakers, three themes, four speakers. We have Professor Daya Thussu from the University of Westminster, and then Sara from the British University in Egypt, and Jasmin Makhlouf from the British University in Egypt as well. And then we have David Harrison, who is an investigative reporter. So we will start with Professor Daya Thussu, who is professor, as I said, at the University of Westminster. His research interests are in globalization and its impact on media cultures and related areas, and he has published, among other publications, Media and Terrorism, Global Perspectives in 2012, which is co-edited with Friedman, News as Entertainment, The Rise of Global Infotainment, which is 2007, and International Communication, Continuity and Change. He will be speaking for 20 minutes, and each of the other speakers will also be speaking for 20 minutes, and we shall have questions at the end of the talks. So may I invite Daya, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished audience. Thank you, Aga Khan University, for organizing this, which I think is the first conference that they have mounted in London on a very, very topical subject. What I'm going to be talking about in the next 19 minutes is really looking at the macro picture. We heard a very accomplished presentation earlier which looked at the micro picture in great detail. I want to look at the bigger one. And I want to argue that misrepresentation of Islam in its broadest sense is a deeply political and problematic situation. It's not just about one particular part of the Islamic world. And it relates directly, in my view, to the geopolitics of the global world we live in, but also politics of international news. So I would start with some examples of this misrepresentation that we see, whether it's in the news and current affairs, supposed to be more accurate representations of reality, to entertainment. And I'm talking really about the global representation. There must be a reason why, since the end of the Cold War, Islam is projected to be a problem in the world. Terrorism has become the most serious threat to our civilization. And much of this discourse is formulated, shaped, distributed largely from a mass media, which is even today mostly dominated by a few hugely powerful, unrepresentative, unelected media corporations. So if you were to look at the top 10 companies in terms of the media revenue, this is the latest data available. 8 out of 10 are American companies, and if you look at the table carefully, 21st Century Fox and news corporations corporation used to be the same organization. It's split now for tax reasons. Also, Viacom and CBS used to be same company until very recently. So if you combine their revenues, the two foreign companies which are on that list, which is the Japanese and the Chinese company, they will be out. So it will be essentially an American thing. This also reflects in terms of global news, which is the focus of my talk. Jeremy Tunstall, a well-known British media sociologist, used this phrase, news duopoly, because Britain also remains pretty significant in terms of international news, particularly BBC and also Reuters. Now is actually owned by a Canadian company, but it's located in the city, London. So from news magazines to business news to 24/7 television news, the Anglo-American domination of mainstream international news is profound. Even in much vaunted digital journalism, if you look at who the big guys are, they are, without exceptions, all American, whether it's BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or Vice or various versions of that. So the US presence in the news sphere is pretty dominant. There are reasons for it. I don't need to go into this for this audience. There's also an increasing tendency to localize and hybridize content to reach a diverse global market, whether it's in the form of newspapers like Wall Street Journal having the Chinese edition, or in entertainment. Here, the picture is from the Indian version of the popular American series called 24, which again, part of it is a terrorism series, terrorism-related story. So because of this localization, the reach of this media is extraordinary. This media also sits very closely in the digital age with the digital empires, Google being the most prominent. If you remember the chart I showed you earlier, the top company in terms of revenue for media was Google. We don't associate Google with media, but actually Google is arguably the most important company. And after NSA revelations and other things we've heard, there is a very important surveillance spying dimension to this media also. And that also feeds into a kind of geopolitics of what gets covered and how it's covered. Now, you might say this is not new, this has been going on for a very long time. And as I said earlier, there are very well-defined reasons why this is the case. Why the English language media, especially Anglo-American media, more American than Anglo, actually dominates the world. The problem is, this domination leads to a rather distorted picture of the world that we see. The audience in this room, an informed, educated audience, discriminating audience, can distinguish between falsehood and bias and accurate news. But for a vast majority of people on this planet, they don't have the time or inclination to do that. And therefore, what we see about or hear about the world from this particular lens is hugely problematic. I'll share this map of the world with you. I don't know who drew it, so I haven't got a source for it. I found it on the net. But it's an interesting indication of how the Americans see the world. You might say the only accurate thing in this map is that UK is shown as the 51st state of the United States, which after Brexit is very possible. But Africa remains an empty area. Latin America, coffee, and Middle East, we're discussing in this conference, oil and war. There's also apologies to my American friends in the room, but Americans are famously ignorant about geography. So they got this map wrong also, in the sense that they mixed up India and China. It should be a little bit around. Microsoft is India and Nike is China, because 80% of global electronic outsourcing industry happens in India, not in China. So anyway, that's just a way of making a point about this amazing ignorance of geography. What it shows is actually a deeper problem, and it's not just about Islam. It's about a very limited view of the world that we see on our television screens, that we read about in foreign pages, newspapers, and that is not only for the consumption of populations in the Western world, but given the range and reach of these publications, these media, they are actually reaching a global audience. So there is a fundamental structural problem. And again, I don't need to really elaborate. This is a well-known discourse. In 1977, Jeremy Dunstall wrote a book looking at the state of global media, and this was the title of the book. The media are Americans, very well cited. Both most media sources who do international news refer to this book. 30 years later, Tunstall, now a wizened old man, emeritus professor, wrote another book. And he changed R for where. He said media were American. And his key argument was looking at media in big countries, big population countries, China, India, Indonesia, Egypt, and Russia, and arguing that actually they're not American. A lot of local media has come up, and that has upset this old, well-established pattern of where the news comes from, who shapes it, who sets the agenda. That is being disrupted because of growth of local media, and that's also connected with the general power shift. That the Chinese today are sitting with $3 trillion to spare. No other country has that kind of money. So this also reflects, for instance, in mainstream television news today. You don't need to just watch the BBC or CNN to find out what's happening in the world. There are various other versions available in English, whether it is a party from Russia, Al Jazeera, the colleague sitting next to me who speaks of Al Jazeera, which has really redefined journalism, first in the Arab world and now since 2006, made a very important contribution to international news. It claims to have to privilege the South in its coverage of the global stories. And of course, CCTV news is increasingly important, not so much in Europe, but certainly in Africa. The Iranians have Press TV, NHK, Japanese, even the French have an English language channel. TRT World, most recently launched by Turkey after the July coup, to tell the world their version of what happened in Istanbul. So something quite interesting is happening in the world of international news. People are accessing different versions of reality. So for instance, if you watch RT, which I do for work because I'm a professor of international communication, I'm actually writing a book at the moment on what I'm calling the changing geopolitics of global communications. I've got my PhD is in international relations, so I look at media and communication from that perspective. And I've benefited enormously by looking at what the Chinese are saying, what the Russians are saying, what the Iranians are saying, what the Turks are saying. And it gives me a slightly more, I would say, more nuanced, more balanced understanding of, for instance, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Yemen. And I think that's something which, of course, it's not mainstream media, but it is increasingly visible to the extent that it is creating, especially RT, is creating problems in many job studies in Europe. It claims to have the largest audience of any 24/7 news network on YouTube. And remember, majority of young people are watching news not on television, but on their computers. What further complicates this is the recent growth of non-state actors. We heard about that also in the first session. Here are some examples, particularly in relation to the topic of this conference, particularly in relation to the Islamic world and specifically Arab world. And these, just representative section here, these have also provided a different kind of perspective, a kind of what Marwan was, saying, it's creative insurgency, and it's fascinating, and still very early stages in terms of its impact on how news agendas are set up. This also feeds into the mainstream media, and that's the problematic bit, because yesterday I teach a master's course in my university, a global media course, and I have a student in the audience also. Good to see you here. There were some Chinese students who were doing a presentation of ISIS propaganda, which excited me. What Chinese students doing ISIS? That's interesting, because they are not generally interested in anything beyond China. But what they presented, a kind of part of history of ISIS, was quite worrying, because they assumed there was a channel which was the dedicated television news channel where they're putting this propaganda out. And as our friend who is actually from Egypt reminded them that actually this is the sports channel of Al Jazeera. It's got nothing to do with jihadi propaganda. So there is this kind of idea somehow that it's all connected, and it is all because it's in a foreign language. So these non-state acts are actually making things more complicated in many ways and opening up the discourse in other ways. And this is precisely because what's happening with the digital world more broadly. This is the latest World Development Report from the World Bank, 2016 report, and it shows us what's happening on the internet each day. 808 billion YouTube views, 207 billion emails. So we live in this digital deluge. There's too much information. All kinds of stuff is traversing through the digital superhighways around the world. Fake news, memes, distortions, etc. And that could lead to all kinds of problems. I'll just give you one example to illustrate the problem. Some of you may be aware of this story some time ago, but it's a very British story. It relates to Syria. Let me remember the story, Lord. Okay, Amina Araf al-Omari was the blogger, supposed to be blogger in Damascus in Syria, and she was writing about what was happening to her capital. And she was a gay woman, so it fitted all the stereotypes that you could imagine. And here there was a Muslim woman who was gay and who was writing all this critical stuff about Assad and his government. It turned out that Mr. Tom, who was a PhD student in Glasgow, I think it was writing his blogs just for fun. He even stole the picture of Jelena, who is from Serbia and worked in a city in London, took her picture from her Facebook and put it on this blog. And the Guardian and the BBC and everybody fell for it. Guardian, the BBC, remember, I'm not talking about some underground, subversive media. I'm talking about highest professional journalism. So there are. This is just one example. I can give you dozens about this deceit, the digital deceit, which is part of this media environment. Now, what is the reality? Just very quickly, 2 points to illustrate. If you look at who is the victim of terrorism in the world, This is from the Economist Bailey's recent data. Majority of deaths in the last 12 years have, if we look at, apart from Philippines, and India also has 180 million Muslims, so India could be considered substantially Muslim country. Apart from Philippines, all other countries where there have been the most deaths are in the Muslim world. But they don't get the kind of prominence you get that the French attack or the other European or American deaths receive. And that again is this problem which I started with, which is the structural problem of who sets the news agenda, who controls it, how it is managed and regulated. Similarly, the debate about migration, which has been a very important debate in this country and also in Europe, arguably contributing to the Brexit decision. Maximum migration is in the Arab countries and within, of course, if you look at Syria, Iraq, Jordan, I mean the biggest population, that from 23 million displaced lived, half of 23 million lived in just two countries, Syria and Iraq. If you contrast that, what the numbers are in Europe, I mean, this is, we talk about some hundreds in Britain. So, distortions lead to misconception leads to a very badly formulated discourse, distorted discourse, and that leads to all kinds of political. But my final slide also looks at the other side of the picture, whether there is potential for resistance of change, and not just in terms of the bigger players providing a different kind of perspective, but also a kind of organic globalization from below kind of argument. So, for instance, a growing presence of content which is coming not from professional broadcasters or journalists, from ordinary citizens, that is creating a new and interesting intervention in debates about representation. When CNN became a big player after the Gulf War, first Gulf War, you remember, academics, scholars, policy people were talking about CNN effect, how presence of those cameras affected policy. 2003 Iraq invasion, Al Jazeera effect became very fascinating. Al Jazeera was able to show pictures that CNN and BBC thought were not suitable. In this Syrian conflict, YouTube has become integral to the media war, being deployed by all parties to the conflict, regional, national, international. But given that there is a growing presence of media coming from different geographical, cultural, political locations, and a trend which is likely to grow as digital connectivity becomes more established, it's going to also influence the way we represent political countries. And finally, the system which is under construction, this digital infrastructure, is pretty problematic. It is leaking because it's under construction. So whether it's WikiLeaks and what we all know about how it might impact the election on the 8th of November in the US, to Snowden, to Panama Papers, there is a, again, potentially very interesting opening to challenge the established ways of thinking about not just Islam or terrorism or Muslims, but more generally about the wider world. And therefore, perhaps offering a more pluralistic and democratic space for representation. But having said that, I'm cynical enough or old enough to recognize that the big power structures do not change that easily. And it is a long battle, but I see a lot of interesting openings. And whether it is the Google kind of surveillance and spying and control of information and trading of data, there's also the possibility of all kinds of relatively small players making an impact in the way the discourse is shaped and geopolitics is made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Thussu. That was very informative, and also bringing together these various strands of what is around, and perhaps a little bit looking into the future. Our second speakers, or second theme, is villains or heroes, a critical analysis of the positive and negative depiction of Muslims in Western and non-Western comics. It's very interesting. We have Sara and Jasmin Makhlouf, both, as I said, are from the British University in Egypt, and they will give us their presentations. Perhaps
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Institute for the Study of Civilisations for inviting me and my colleague, Ms. Jasmin Makhlouf, from the British University in Egypt. And today, me and Jasmin, we are presenting something about comics, and our presentation title is Villains or Heroes, a critical analysis of the positive and negative depictions of Muslims in Western and non-Western comics. This presentation is divided into two parts. I'm here only to give the introduction. Jasmin is going to present the part about the Western comic, and I will join you later at the end to present the non-Western comics from the Middle East. And I have a selection of basically 3. So I would just give a small introduction, and then I will leave the floor to my colleague, Ms. Jasmin Makhlouf, who also I'm proud to say that Ms. Jasmin, she was actually my former student, so I'm really, really proud of her today. So please let me start with my small introduction. And I have to say that today across the globe, all cultures have been influenced by media images. However, the projector? Yes. Okay, I'll just continue with my introduction if everyone is listening. Just this one. Sorry for the interruption. So I was just saying that across the globe, all culture rely on the transmission of media images in order to give this certain ideas about certain things. However, most often we are influenced by media perception and media stereotyping and media framing. So for instance, when we talk about Western media images about Muslim and Islams, they are usually depicted negatively, they are usually misrepresented, and when you see them in the comics, for instance, it's very interesting to note how they are usually pictured like dark-skinned, they are usually dark-bearded, and sometimes, and most often, their behavior are characterized by rudeness and ignorance. And this, we especially, we people who come from the Middle East, sometimes that's really annoying for us, because we want to present the other image that no one actually sees. And this is why the main aim of this presentation is that we wanted to examine why the comic space is becoming very powerful these days in the Middle East. Another thing that we wanted to check or to analyze is to what extent comics actually perpetuate or challenge the representation of Muslims, whether in the Western comics or in the non-Western comics. And we analyzed the idea of representation in the sense that people would argue that representation can actually mean that you are speaking on behalf of someone, or that you are actually describing something through language, or as Stereotypes defines, is that representation entails an association between the daily interactions of individuals and the understandings they carry, for instance, for objects, for ideas in their heads. But we present this idea about the fact that representation can sometimes entail difference, and difference can be positive or it can be negative. It doesn't always have to be negative. And the reason that me and Jasmin, we decided to work with comics is because of the fact that comics have this power to present the image of the other. Because it has this feature of a visual and a verbal narrative that allows you to give this idea about the other in two interesting ways, whether through the pictures, or through the comic panels, or through the language, through the narratology, through the narrative, through the story. So it gives you a way to maneuver around the kind of representation you want to say about the others. But why comics now? Why are we especially coming to this idea that we need to examine comics? Some people would argue that due to the recent incident of Charlie Hebdo in Paris in 2015, it attracted lots and lots and lots of curiosities for people, whether in the East or the West, to start studying comics. However, for me, the main reason I'm interested to study comics is because, for instance, back home in Egypt, what's so nice is that comics are not exposed to any kind of process like filtering or editing like films. And this is why it's very nice to see how the culture and how the representation of culture and the representation of different things in particular societies are portrayed from this perspective of the individuals themselves. And now I will leave the floor to my colleague, Ms. Jasmin, and Jasmin is going to present the part about non-Western comics, and I will leave the floor to her. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and it's an honor. And thank you, Sara, for the very nice introduction. How do I use the slides? Okay. Someone over. Okay. This section of the presentation will discuss three main concepts: terrorism, Islamophobia, and Jihad. These three concepts are usually interconnected, and they tend to portray what the Arab world means to the West. First of all, we're going to start with terrorism. When I was doing my research on terrorism, I found many different definitions because, as any other concept, it keeps on evolving and it's very dynamic. But the definition that I found most appropriate for the purpose was the definition recommended by Lord of Berwick, and he defined it as the use of serious violence against persons or property, or threat to use such violence to intimidate or coerce a government, the public, or any section of the public in order to promote political, social, and ideological objectives. We chose this definition because it incorporated the ideological part. As we will see in the presentation, Islam is not seen as a religion, but rather a political tool, a political ideology. This comic, it's part of Superman and Checkmate, in case someone wants to Google it later on. And it represents Superman, the white American, the white American superhero, and he's negotiating with a terrorist. This terrorist organization basically hijacked a nuclear American aircraft carrier, nuclear American, remember the keywords, and he's basically trying to negotiate and asking him why he's doing this, and he replies by saying, "Silence, capitalist tool, I am the fist of Allah, I will do the speaking, the angels of Allah have seized the American warship, Its crewmen are our prisoners in the war to unite the Arab Brotherhood against the heathen world. We also have taken prisoners the Kurakan Minister of Defense. His nation's independent acts of violence are the greatest barriers to uniting. First of all, I'd like you to remember the definition. So we're having an ideology behind the attack. Islam, again, is not seen as a religion, but rather a political ideology. Second thing, what did they do? I touched the screen. Okay, how do we go back? Like this? No? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. And what was I saying? Yes, the definition, and they're using violence, or actually threatening to use this violence against a segment of society or government. I'd like you to focus on the actual name of the character. The artist that created the comic intentionally named the character after the name of Allah, which basically means God. Oh. Technology is not my thing, even though I'm young. Thank you. All right. Allah basically means God in Arabic. It's not a different, oh my goodness, a different God. And he called them fist of Allah. Whenever we envision a fist in our head, we usually think of strength. We usually think of violence. So therefore, he's associating the name of God to violence and strength. This is the leader of the terrorist organization. What about the subordinates to the leader, the angels of Allah? He's again trying to demonize holy figures such as God and angels, and trying to link them to the stereotypical image that all Muslims are violent. Okay. Another important element in this comic is the fact that the Arab Brotherhood, the war is supposed to unite the Arab Brotherhood. We'll explore this concept after Islamophobia. So again, we're seeing that we have names that tend us to constantly remind us, repeating and reinforcing the stereotype that Muslims are violent, and that Islam is a political ideology rather than a religion. The second concept, as I told you, is Islamophobia. Again, there was this very interesting book called Islamophobia by Chris Allen, and in the very beginning, before defining what Islamophobia is, he asked the question, does Islamophobia exist? The answer to this question was a 19-year-old woman was beaten around the head, and she was wearing a hijab with a baseball bat. That was the answer. These incidents happen every day in real life, and these violent attitudes toward Islam are reinforced in comics. The idea is that when he came to define it, he used statistics to prove the existence of Islamophobia, and he defined it as a phenomenon. However, he didn't give us an actual definition of what Islamophobia is. While another scholar defined it as the violent and hateful acts toward Muslims, or most of them. In this case, Islamophobia is reinforced by portraying the Joker as the ambassador of the Iranian Republic. This comic was created 10 years after the Iranian Revolution, when the U.S. foreign policy toward Iran has dramatically changed. Before, they used to have a very strong economic ties, and after the revolution, these ties were broken. The comic artist in this case is trying to reflect the foreign policy of his country. Just for you to know, the Joker is an actual, it's always the villain in the comic. It's the arch nemesis of Batman. And he's characterized by a chameleon personality, which means that his personality changes based on the benefits that he can take from a certain situation. And he's also a psychopath and a sociopath. Keep these in mind. In the cartoon, sorry, In the cartoon, the situation is basically that Batman is trying to fight a terrorist outside of the UN General Assembly, and the Ayatollah Khomeini appoints the Joker, surprisingly, to be the ambassador of the Iranian Republic to the UN General Assembly. And the Joker starts his speech by saying, "It is a great honor for me to be here tonight. I'm proud to speak for the great Islamic Republic of Iran. That country's current leader and I have a lot in common: insanity and great love of fish. But unfortunately, we also share a mutual problem. We get no respect. Everyone thinks Iran is the home of the terrorist leader. They say even worse things about me, would you believe?" Again, the text tells us a lot about the political situation between the two countries. First of all, insanity. Again, the comic artist is trying to portray Arabs as insane and irrational. However, the ignorance is that Arabs are not Persians and Persians are not Arabs. There's a clear distinction between races and ethnicities. And the thing is, not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. So you can tell the ignorance of the artist while creating the character itself. And then he continues by saying, "But unfortunately, we also share a mutual problem. We get no respect." Usually, when people discuss Islamophobia, some scholars claim that Islam is perceived, if not as a political ideology, but as an inferior religion, if it's an actual religion. And again, it's emphasizing that Iran is the land of the terrorists, leader. And again, we can have a look at the attire. He's wearing traditional Arab clothes, again, re-emphasizing and reinforcing the stereotypes of Muslim terrorists. The third concept is jihad. Jihad is a very not controversial, but discussed concept even within the Islamic school, because the general definition of what jihad is that is the struggle or the striving of becoming a better Muslim and following the teachings of Islam. And these teachings are supposed to be peaceful. Muslims strive to become better individuals in society. On the other hand, we see the Western perception of jihad, and the literal translation is struggling. And this struggling to them is a war that causes Islam, and therefore it becomes a holy war. The thing in this comic was made after 9/11 by Frank Miller. Frank Miller is a prominent comic artist who has very, very obvious standpoint regarding jihad. In this slide, we can see that this is the explosion that happened in 9/11, and on it, the box says Islam 3 dots jihad, meaning that Islam really equals to the holy war, and Islam is only about that, which is not true. Okay, again, we're reinforcing the violent nature of Islam as a political tool and as an inferior religion. And again, we see the man bowing down to what is supposed to be an inferior god. The last section will discuss women in Islam and the condition of women in Islam. We all know that, according to Western perceptions, Muslim women are supposed to be saved, because we need to be liberated, because the veil is a sign of oppression instead of liberation. But what we don't understand, like Samuel Huntington was talking about in the Clashes of Civilization, is that there's no bridge for communication, there's no understanding. And that's why their perception is different, because they really don't understand the core of what their religion is about. In this comic, we see the Prime Minister of Kurkan, the one who was kidnapped previously in the previous comic, and he's talking to Lois Lane, which is like the journalist of the comic. And they're talking, and the minister replies, "Indeed not. In the proper place, the females of Kurak know their place." Females, not even women. A woman, in this specific sentence, is objectified and is just a female. It's an object that can be moved around. I like their American cousins. So he's trying to emphasize, the artist is trying to emphasize the difference of being a female in the East and a woman in the West. And then she replies, "Welcome to the 20th century," as if in the East, we all live in a prehistoric era. Yes. Okay, 2 minutes. All right. So again, the stereotype that women should be saved is reinforced, especially in the slide where the minister slaps the journalist. But again, the journalist is saved by the white American man. Thank you. I'll now leave the floor to my colleagues, and I hope this was interesting. I don't know.
And now we come to the fun part of it, comics from the Middle East. And the first one I start with is actually a comic titled The 1990. In the 1990, it's the first Middle Eastern comics that started to address Western audiences about the misconception of Islam. And this comic was developed by a Kuwaiti citizen called Naif Mutawa. And the story of the 99, I would like to start with a small introduction about it, because I'm not sure if anyone, did anyone have a chance to read this comic? Okay. So I would like to give a small introduction about its story. And basically, the comic story of the 1990, it starts with the invasion of Baghdad in the 11th century by the grandson of Genghis Khan, whose army destroyed the famous Dar al-Hikmah. And Dar al-Hikmah is the house of wisdom. So someone knows what I'm talking about. I'm so happy. And his armies destroy the house of Hikmah. And what they try to do is that they discard all of the books in this house of Hikmah, in the house of wisdom, into the river. And what happens later on in the story is the fact that in order to preserve the knowledge of these kind of precious books that come from the house of wisdom, is the fact that some librarians, they throw gemstones into the river, and these gemstones are later to be found by a doctor called Dr. Ramzi. And Dr. Ramzi is someone who administers a very nice foundation in Paris, who tries later on to go and maneuver all around the Middle East to find the gem bearers that were actually thrown into the river. So this is basically how the comic story starts. Are you following up, or I'm going too fast? If I speak too fast, please do tell me. Okay. And the reason that Naif Mutawa...
Yeah, we're having a lot of technical problems, technical issues.
I think we're so stressed out, me and Jasmin, it's just coming out in the technology.
Yes, this is our first encounter with technology.
You know, it's very stressful when you come to a conference and you look like the youngest people and you're presenting this new idea and everyone, we're attending, oh my god, this has to be a good presentation. It's okay. It's okay. And I would like to share with you the statements of Naif Mutawa, what he said. And the basic reason that he decided to do this comic is that he was so annoyed by the representation of Islam, especially after the collapse of the Twin Towers, after 9/11. And what he came out and said is the following. I had already made a decision that I needed to find a way to take back Islam from its hostage takers. But I didn't know how. The answer was staring me in the face. It was as simple and as difficult as the multiplication of 9 by 11, the 99. So at the age of 32, I uncapped my pen to create a concept that could be popular in the East and the West. I would go back to the very sources from which others took violent and hateful messages and offer messages of tolerance and peace in their place. I would give my heroes a Trojan horse in the form of the 99. Islam was my Helen, I wanted her back. And this is basically the statement that he provided after 9/11. And it's so interesting in this presentation is that me and Jasmin, we decided to use this story. This story is called the story of Noura. And the story of Noura, it gives you a story about a girl who comes from the United Arab Emirates. And this girl has been abducted by kidnappers. And the kidnappers, they asked her father to pay a ransom. However, her father refused to pay this ransom. And she was talking to Dr. Ramzi and sharing her thoughts with him in the sense that she was really, really annoyed by him that he didn't give them the ransom and that he gave her up to the kidnappers who abducted her. But why did we decide to choose this story? And what is so different about this story from the other stories presented in the Western comics? It is important to highlight that this story, it shows something really important. It says that unfair practices, they still exist in the Middle East. We are not saying they don't. They still exist in the Middle East. And there are still, and a lot of time we are accused for unjust behaviors towards women. We are not denying it. But what Naif Mutawar was doing is that he wanted to give this other picture. What he did is that instead of focusing on the idea that her father rejected to pay the ransom, he provides in his comic how in Islam, Allah ordered us not to say a word of contempt nor repel any of them. And this was the focus in his story. He was saying, yes, her father did bad stuff. Yes, he didn't pay the ransom. Yes. But instead of focusing on the negative stereotyped representation of these kinds of behaviors, what he did is that he reminded us how in Islam, God told us not to do that. This is not the acceptable way to do it. So what happens is that the character of Noura, it becomes a symbol of mercy rather than vengeance. And what happens is that he was trying to eliminate the peaceful nature of Islam. And I know lots of people would argue about me with that. It's even interesting to note that how the first female character that he presented in his comic, she is not veiled, she is not wearing a chador, she is not wearing the hijab. Instead, the character is actually visualized in a very stylish and attractive design. She's basically like wearing, like, this is her. I'm really sorry, we're supposed to have another picture, it's not coming out. She was wearing a jeans, a normal t-shirt, like westernized kind of clothes. The pictures. Okay. She was visualized in an attractive style image. And it's very important that, as you know, sometimes we, the Middle Eastern women, we are portrayed in this body bag. They say we wear clothes in a body bag, and we can't wear jeans, and we can't wear t-shirts, and so on. And this is the first one that I wanted to, like, this is the first Middle Eastern comics to address Western audiences about the misconceptions about Islam. The second one I would like to talk about is, where are the pictures? Okay, the second comic I would like, Can we open it from the flash drive?
Yeah, I gave it.
We are eating, I'm afraid, into the time of the
Okay, just
speaker.
more 3 minutes. 3 minutes. The other comic I would like to talk about is Persepolis. Persepolis, it's a graphic novel from, it was done by an Iranian. Her name is Stereotypes. And this comic, it talks about the childhood of a young girl who was growing up in Iran during and after the time of the 1979 revolution. And what's so interesting about this graphic novel or this comic is the fact that, I'm really sorry about the picture, something is wrong with our PowerPoint presentation and the pictures are not shown. And what's so interesting about this graphic novel is the fact that it is written from a perspective of a young kid. It's not written from a perspective of an adult who used to live in Iran. And the story we are using, it comes from a chapter titled The Veil. And the part we are using, we are basically showing how that during the time of the 1979 revolution, women were going out and protesting on the streets, on the veil. They were against it. They didn't want to wear it. But there were groups of women who were calling for it, and there were others who were calling against it. And the thing is that it's very interesting to note how her mother, this young kid who was narrating her story, how her young kid was showing the perspective of her mother, and the fact that she had to dye her hair because she was afraid so hard to get in prison because of the stuff that she was saying on the streets. So they wanted to project this idea is that Iran is a country that's not characterized by Islamic extremism, Islamic fundamentalism, and the fact that the veil is actually not a signifier of women's oppression, because there were women from both sides, women protesting for it and women calling for it. And the final comic that I would like to present is Qahira, and Qahira is...
I can pass it around.
Okay. I think we have Qahira. And Qahira is an Egyptian online webcomic that was developed by an undergraduate student at the American University in Cairo. Her name is Dina Muhammad. And Dina Muhammad wanted to fight against all the misogynistic opinion on Egyptian women, and particularly veiled women. And it's so interesting that she wanted to say, like, when I met her in a conference, what she said to me is that I wanted to create a superhero to face some of the things that frustrated me, especially the patriarchy that is evident in post-revolutionary Egypt. I feel like there is a need for Muslim superheroes who actually deal with the real-life issues we face of fictional supervillains. Because let's face it, half of the things Muslim women have to deal with feel like they've been conducted by supervillains. And the comic that I decided to choose, it talks about female. And we had our first presenter today talking about female. And she was like saying that in her comic, and what she was trying to show is that female were becoming like male chauvinists. They were like wanting to protect Muslim women. And she was like, why are you doing this to us? We are strong, independent young women who are veiled, yes, but we can take in charge of ourselves. We don't need you to save us. We can save ourselves. And what's so interesting is that, as you can see in this last one, she decided to take all of them and hang them. Like hang them on the tree, not actually hang them. So she wanted to fight this idea of essentialism by the Western media. And she wanted to show the idea that a weapon like a hijab lasso, which is this hijab lasso, can actually be liberating for women.
Absolutely. That is very symbolic, I think, perhaps. Could we finish it now, please? Because we do have only half an hour.
And I would like to conclude that me and Jasmin, we presented these three particularly comics from the Middle East because the first one, it comes from Kuwait, which is a country in the Gulf region. The second one is from Iran, which represents a different area in the Middle East. And the third one, it comes from Egypt. So we wanted to provide different perspectives on the kind of representations that they would give to the audience. Thank you very much, and we'd love to have a discussion.
Thank you, Sara and Jasmin. I'm sorry the technological problems that we have encountered this morning, and it's quite a symbolic, or rather a talk which is full of symbolism, images, and it is a pity that we could listen to it fully. Our third speaker is David and Harrison, and I've introduced him already. He's from Al Jazeera, so please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Farouk. Okay, so it's Muslims in the media, free media, friends or foes is the subject. And it may seem a slightly odd question to ask, but I'm basing a lot of what I'm going to say on my experience, as a journalist covering Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries, and many others besides, over 3 decades. During that time, I've also, and I still do, take time out to train journalists in developing countries, and many of the recent countries I've been to happen to be predominantly Muslim. I'm talking about Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, Afghanistan, and many others. And one thing that's interesting is that to look at the state of media in many of these countries. And in Sudan, for example, there are a lot of very, very brave journalists. In fact, you need to be far braver to be a journalist in Sudan than you do to be a journalist in the UK. At every newspaper office, for example, there's a member of the NIS intelligence agency, stationed in the office. That would be like having someone from MI5 in the Sunday Times. You know, it sounds outlandish, but this is the reality they have to deal with. And those guys are there for one reason, to make sure that nothing goes in that paper that isn't approved by the government. The media is mere propaganda. Within that, there are fantastic journalists who are struggling to produce what we call professional journalism, real journalism. And one of my roles out there is to help them to do that and to find ways of getting stories into newspapers without getting them thrown in jail. Doesn't always work. Many journalists in Sudan are thrown in jail 3 days, a day, a week, a month, because they published a paper, they've written a story which, you know, is not government propaganda. Newspapers are regularly closed down, very often just at the point where they've paid all their printing bills and the paper's about to go off the presses. They get a call from the intelligence service, you know, stop that paper. Now, this is the sort of brutality that you see in many countries, and not just predominantly Muslim countries at all, many autocratic countries. It just so happens that many predominantly Muslim countries are in the hands of regimes that are brutal and autocratic. So those journalists out there are doing a fantastic job, and they want to be professional journalists. They understand what it means. And what does it mean to be part of a free media? Well, it means professionalism. It means accuracy, checking facts. It means balance. It means talking to multiple sources, every party involved in the story. It means that you produce something that is informing your readers or your viewers, not lying to them, not giving them propaganda. And I've been constantly impressed by the number of journalists who happen to be Muslim who understand those values and want to do it, but are prevented from doing so by pretty unpleasant regimes, and worse still, by editors who self-censor and prevent journalists publishing stories that, you know, should be out there. And I'm not even just talking about political stories, although that's obviously an important category. I'm also talking about stories about things that affect people's lives, the state of schools and education, the state of hospitals, the state of transport. These are the stories that we were trying to get into the papers, things that really affect people's lives. In Algeria, another country, it's a slightly different take there. The regime actually allows so-called opposition papers. And this is part of the problem. But a lot of the media in many countries do not understand the notion of an independent press. It's either government or it's opposition. In other words, they're allied to political parties and they're fighting a political battle on behalf of those parties. That's not what a free media is about. Because a free media is there to inform the electorate, to give them information so that essentially when they go to the polls, they know who they're voting for and what they're voting for. That's what a robust, vigorous, free press does. And many of these countries, they're simply not allowed to do it, even though they understand the importance of it. And why is it important? It's important because the media should address the concerns of the people. The media should not be there to propagate the views of political parties. I've seen it in Egypt. I was in Egypt, you know, quite a few times until 2013, 2014 period. And there was no independent media at all. They're all in the pockets of one side or another. And it's a huge problem because you've got many journalists who aspire to be professional. They're not getting the training, they're not getting the backing, and they're living under a regime that will simply silence them. Sometimes with jail, sometimes with a bullet. So there's an awful lot of work to be done in those countries to create an atmosphere where a free media can thrive. And that free media is a friend of Muslims and of everybody in the world, because that free media reflects the views and the realities of the people who live in those countries. It should articulate their concerns and should act as a pressure on government to improve. Now, you know, I've seen that in many countries, but it's all about degrees of state control. I mean, there's no one size fits all. They're all slightly different. And some are more benign dictators. But ultimately, they're all about degrees of state control. There isn't a genuine freedom, which I would argue is a friend of everybody, Muslim and non-Muslim. Now, in the West and the UK, we've been fortunate in a sense that we've been allowed to evolve a freer press over many decades, even centuries. The UK has enjoyed 400 years of stable democracy. That's kind of how long it takes to do these things. But we must remember that even in the UK, only 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, it was considered a privilege to be given an interview by a cabinet minister. That's not a long time. That's probably my grandparents' generation. They can remember that, a time when the government would deign to give an interview. And it was considered, there was still a culture of deference. Fortunately, that's gone in recent decades. And we now have a very robust, very vigorous media in this country. That's not to say all is well. There are many problems, many flaws in the Western media. Daya touched on some of them. Because a free press and democracy are not, a democracy and the free press that underpins it, they're not things that you take for granted, and there's a constant battle. The forces of politics and big business will always try to erode the freedom of the media. And we've seen it with the rise of big corporations now, global organizations who exercise a power completely disproportionate to the influence that they should have. This is something we all have to guard against. And then you've got, some of these corporations, they run big media groups. Of course they do. And they're incredibly powerful. And essentially, it is their worldview that is propagated to many other countries. Now, having said all that, it's very important that we don't get carried away and say, oh, all these big Western organizations are simply pumping out propaganda. No, they're not. There is, for example, there is an awful lot of first-class journalism being done by many of these media organizations. Fantastic investigations, exposés, doing what the free press should do, holding power to account on behalf of the electorate, asking questions. We give these people enormous power. We elect them. We say to them, go on, change the laws. Decide how much tax you can take out of my pocket. That's what we're doing to them when we give them power. So, aren't we entitled to ask questions of them? How are you spending my money? Why are you making that law? Okay? And we have a whole system of lobbying and pressure, and that's how, in the end, you hope, as a result of pressure, debate, discussion, parliamentary debate, eventually you get legislation which you hope satisfies the majority to a point. So, there are other problems with the Western media, and they're partly the function of a Western view of the world. They're partly the function of recent events. So you take something like migration and refugees. Now, fortunately, we have a spectrum of media in this country. You don't have to read the Daily Mail. You can read the Guardian. You can read the Financial Times. We have a great spectrum. You can choose. But some of those newspapers, such as the Daily Mail, are extremely powerful and influential. And so the language they use and the views that they spread are important. And if you take something like the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, you see how interesting it was that they were conflated. That suddenly all refugees were migrants. And it's only a short step from saying, we found one terrorist among these millions, therefore they're all terrorists. And it's very easy with the use of language to conflate those things, so that all Muslims are terrorists, all migrants, all refugees are migrants. This is incredibly damaging, and it all comes down to the language that's used. If you talk about, you see a story, it might be of a crime, a rape, for example, and if that rapist is Polish or Middle Eastern Muslim, you can bet your bottom dollar in the Daily Mail that will be in there somewhere, it may even be in the headline. But if someone British commits a crime like that, a rape or something, you don't see that. White man charged with rape, guilty of rape. You don't see it. And this is a subtle way that what I would describe as hate language is used to pander to people's prejudices. And the subliminal effect is all Poles, all Middle East, all Muslims are rapists, are criminals, are terrorists. And it's very easy to get that effect because you're pandering to people's fears. This is a country, you have to remember, that 70 years ago, 80 years ago, this wasn't unlike many Middle Eastern countries. Everybody went to church. Sunday there were no shops. You had a government, there was a culture of deference, the royal family, the government. You know, it's not that long ago. It was also, there were islands where, yes, you know, we've had people from immigrants coming for centuries, sure. But in, take example, the city of Liverpool, we have the oldest Afro-Caribbean community and the oldest Chinese community because of the port, the great trading. They lived in sort of ghettos. You didn't see them in the city centre. Mercifully, that is all changing. But I just want you to understand the picture of this country and how much it's changed in less than 100 years. It's changed because people used to be much more insular. People didn't see dark faces. In the same way that many, you know, well, I went to live in China at one point. It was when China was just opening to the world. I went off into the far south, the really remote parts where they hadn't seen a white face for 50 years. I had children running away from me. They were terrified. Okay, so nothing's changed there. But, you know, this is about, it's the unknown, it's the other, it's the different. And we're all, if we're honest, we're all slightly afraid of the different and the unknown. All of us. But that's why the media has a role to play in breaking down those barriers and not pandering to those fears. That's human nature to be slightly suspicious of outsiders. You know, we have to face that, accept that. But the media has a massive role to play in breaking down some of those barriers by diversity. And I do courses abroad on diversity reporting, and a lot of it is about hate language and the language used to stereotype people. You know, let's do away with that. You don't need that. It's better to build than to destroy. The BBC, you know, BBC, I guess like all major news organisations, it comes from a certain culture and therefore will have a sort of generally British stroke Western view. That's normal. And the good thing is that Daya touched on this, that now we've got, well, Russia Today, you know, that's not the equivalent of the BBC. Let's not delude ourselves. Those are much more of a propaganda vehicle. But we have other companies now. It's much more spread out. We've got Al Jazeera, you know, who I work for, who I think does some, you know, if I may say so myself, some fabulous work. I work in investigations. We are given freedom, we're given money, we're given time to expose corruption and wrongdoing, according to very, very strict professional standards. So that's helped to give a more perspective of the South, if you like. And I think that's a good thing. The American view, again, let's not get too carried away with the Americans. New York Times, Washington Post, some amazing journalism, first-class journalism. But also Fox News. You know, it's kind of like even a televisual version of the Daily Mail. And it panders to prejudice. And it whips up hysteria and hatred. That's what we've got to guard against. And that's what we need to fight against. Another thing that's made things worse, the Brexit debate. Now, again, there were a lot of reasons for the Brexit vote, and one reason, I think, is because the politicians and successive governments had ignored many people in Britain who felt left out of the prosperity of London and the South East. There was anger. There were genuine concerns about influxes of migrants, genuine concerns. There were concerns about cuts to social services, and these people were ignored. So when Brexit came along, again, the unhelpful work of much of the media, stirring it up, suddenly all these insecurities can be projected onto the migrants. You're taking our jobs. You're taking all of our social welfare. And I sort of feel that, you know, had it been almost any vote, the government would have lost that. It just happened to be, I consider, a rather important one, and went, in my view, and this is purely a personal view, went the wrong way. Because I think what Brexit did, it encouraged people who preferred division to healing. It encouraged them to express their views and whip people up. Make Britain great again. It's no coincidence that Donald Trump has adopted that phrase, make America great again. It's meaningless. We don't make America great by cutting off people, by building walls on Mexico and turning all Muslims away. This is madness. We've also seen globalization. Now that's effective. Social media. Because what's happening there now is that anybody and everybody can express a view which could be inflammatory or not. And the controls we know are there, but they're inadequate. So now suddenly everybody is pitching in and having a say. But globalization can also help. because it can also make us more aware of other cultures, other people, and break down that otherness that I think is at the heart of many of the problems. You know, when Britain was a more insular island, the English used to make jokes about the Irish because they were slightly different. They had a slightly different accent. They lived across the water. They were poor, so they were a minority. And minorities have always had a hard time. The French do it about the Belgians. You know, the Poles did it. It's sort of partly human nature. But if societies are insular, it's much greater because you feel this is your world. In the case of small towns in Britain, white, you know, prosperous, and it's sort of in this enclosed world. And in the past, it was possible to live like that and never see an outsider. Globalization, social media have helped to change that, and I think that's a force for good. Because we're forced to face up to the fact that the world is a wonderful, diverse place, and there are lots of people who don't think the same way as we do. And again, that's a good thing, to have your views challenged and to understand that there are other cultures out there. Okay, it was very interesting in the talk about the refugees and migrants that the language used by many of the papers was, I thought, really inflammatory, really quite shocking, until the little boy was found dead on the beach. Do you remember that picture? And when he was found dead on the beach, suddenly the refugees became human. They became real human beings. And that was a bit of a turning point. I'm not sure it's solved it completely, but it was a bit of a turning point. So what do we do about all of this? Okay. So awareness, again, social media can help that. A more sensitive media can help that. And there is, I'd say, lots of good work going on in this area. Look at some of the coverage on the BBC, it's true, or in The Guardian, many other papers. They are addressing this, many television stations. It's not that nothing's going on. We've got laws that need to be enforced on incitement to hatred, all of that. They're there. They need to be enforced. We need to recruit more members of minorities, including Muslims, not just for the sake of it, but because they can make a positive contribution. I mean, in my line of work, we do a lot of undercover investigations, and there are certain situations when, you know, a white middle-class British guy could simply not go in. You need someone undercover who's going to blend in. So, you know, how lucky are we to have such a diverse culture? We can actually find people from all different backgrounds, colours, creeds, shapes, and everything else. So in the end, we have a choice, I think, and it's a choice the media has to make and that we as citizens have to make, that we can either choose xenophobia, division and hatred, or we can go for tolerance, diversity and understanding. And I know which of the two I'd rather have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Now, because of the various problems we've had, with your indulgence, I would like to extend our time to 5 minutes past 1. So we have at least 15 minutes of questions. May I open the floor to questions, please? Comments? Because we've had 3 very interesting talks. Question there. Could you state your name and affiliation, please?
Thank you, Professor Topan. I am Najim Abbas from IAS. My question is to Professor Thussu. You ended up with saying that there are interesting openings despite a long battle being fought over the domination of a few corporations. Do you think that the exceptions to the dominant norm, for example, WikiLeaks, FactCheck, and Bellingcat, can be institutionalized into practice so that those who take, for example, a discussion of democracy into the trajectory of demagoguery, or manipulate text, images, or visuals, there can be a response back. So to say, look, there are citizens as watchdogs who would hold you to account rather than some lobbying countering other lobbyists. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very difficult question to answer because, as I said in my last slide, that this communication infrastructure is under construction. There are very few norms
which exist. They are trying to create these. One of the biggest debate in the coming decade is going to be about, and it's already started, about who governs the internet. There's already talk of balkanization of the internet. There's a Chinese internet, and there's a Russian internet, and there'll be a Shia internet and Sunni internet. So how one, so the examples I gave, they're essentially all Western. Yeah, WikiLeaks, although it's a globe, but actually, you know, most of the work was done here. If it wasn't for the Guardian and the New York Times and Le Monde, nobody would have heard of WikiLeaks. So the old traditional media, you know, the much maligned newspapers are still very relevant in that context, because they sift this information and make it into news stories, and that's what made WikiLeaks what it became. So I think it's really very early days to suggest some kind of citizen, you know, managed regulatory framework which will, you know, temper these excesses. We have to get used to a lot of misinformation, propaganda being projected as news. It's already happening quite a lot. As you probably know, outside St. Petersburg, there is a big building where there's a Russian trolls who do all kind of stuff. You know, they create stories, they send it around the world. The Chinese are doing this, the Americans are masters of it. So everybody is doing it. So I think this is going to get worse before you can think of how it can be corrected. But the problem is that still the dominant players in this remain largely the United States, because, you know, internet was created there. US actually essentially controls it, both its economic side but also its infrastructure. If you look at who actually owns the cables through which this data travels around the world. So although there are other players emerging in a kind of geopolitical battle going on in the cyberspace, citizens have a role, but if there was a hierarchy of influence, I would put them at quite low down. It may sound very unfashionable thing today, but this is the realist in me. That there are structures and institutions who controls them. You know, that is very important. And I think one of the problems with our field, media communication studies, is that we have sort of left that space for other people to deal with. We do the softer stuff, which is very funny, and can be fun, but doesn't really address the fundamental problem.
Can I just add something there? Just to add something to that, I think it's also true that a lot of the stuff on social media, well, most of it, in fact, is not coming from people who are professional journalists. They're not evaluating it necessarily. A lot of it is simply opinion. So you've got billions of opinions swirling around there, which may be having an undue influence on people. And that's something that is, in the way the internet is configured currently, is impossible to control. But it's something we should be aware of. And that's why I think citizen journalism can be great. We saw it in Iran, didn't we? The way they, you know, it was social media, Twitter that got that stuff out. Fantastic. But I think we should be aware of its limitations. That a lot of the stuff on social media is not fact, it's opinion, and should therefore be treated with caution.
Question here and then question there.
Thank you, Ali Bahaji, North South Publications. The speed of news today and the internet and social media makes it impossible to check the facts. How can we actually address that huge problem? It's not a small problem. Okay, thank you.
I think the answer to that is professional journalism. I really do. Because certainly in all the publications and TV companies I've worked for, there is rigorous fact-checking. And that goes on. If you put stuff out on Twitter and stuff, that's not checked. But you know, the process within professional newsrooms is rigorous. And stuff is checked, it's balanced, all of those, there's a whole series of checks that go on different levels. And that, I think, that is something that can never be reproduced on the internet with people throwing out opinions on Twitter and social media. And that's why I think there will always be room for professional journalists.
Can I just add something to this? One of the great advantages of internet is that you have access to all kinds of opinion. For the last 2.5 years now, 3 years even, I regularly read the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I realize how parochial British press is in comparison, how much more sophisticated their coverage is of the world. But it is the same newspaper, New York Times, for example, the newspaper of record, arguably the most influential newspaper in the world, which told us, not in one story, but in a whole series of stories, that Saddam Hussein had chemical and nuclear weapons, that Al-Qaeda had a branch operating in Iraq. Just to give you two prominent examples. So that is, I mean, it's not just about facts. I mean, who is checking those facts and which facts are highlighted, which are ignored? I mean, and that is a political, deeply geopolitical question. So New York Times, with all its highest professional standards, can actually get something that badly wrong. Yeah. So then you ask, are they not professional enough to realize that that's not the case? Because the intelligence we circulated was very dodgy. We all know. We knew it at that time. Those of us who studied these things, it was very clear. This information was in public domain. Why is a newspaper of that repute and sophistication chose not to highlight that? And that's a fundamentally political. And that's about the problem I was trying to highlight in my presentation, that who has control of that agenda-setting power remains crucially important.
Yeah. I think also on that point there, I mean, the way that should have been reported, and was in some newspapers, let's be frank, there's a lot of skepticism about that.
New York Times
as well.
I don't New York Times.
Yeah. The way that should have been reported is these are claims made by, and according to intelligence services. And then, a proper reporter would then pursue that and investigate and find out whether that is actually true and do another story or make the same story balanced. So that, again, it just falls down to professionalism, I think.
Yeah, but even with professionalism, actually, it's overlapped. Because in the past, you had a foreign journalist on the spot who would check the story. Yeah. Today, you don't have those.
Well, you do. It still exists. No, it does still exist, but it has been a problem that the finances of the media have suffered massively from the rise of the internet. The economics of newspapers now are the economics of the madhouse. Churning out all these newspapers and putting them into lorries and on trains and on planes is phenomenally expensive when you can just push a button and get it out on the internet. So newspapers are suffering because of that, and that's why they're becoming media companies who are doing print and online and all the rest of it. But they're still struggling financially because no one has really yet found a way to make internet journalism pay, online journalism. Some of them have paywalls. So the consequences are actually, and I think you're getting at that, are quite serious. Because what we have here is media organizations who have to close foreign bureaus. And so, yes, there are fewer people on the ground. One positive side to that is that they're using far more local journalists who are, again, given proper training. So that's, I think, a good thing. But you're right, there are potentially serious consequences of not having enough people on the ground.
Two more questions, one there and then one there.
Thank you very much. And a note on that last comment, there are, of course, because the internet sees gaps and fills them, a whole lot of new sites called facts. And fact-checking. They've got all sorts of names like that, and they're coming in from all different countries, often taking various speeches apart and showing what is on them. So there's a great deal of fact-checking now available right online.
That's good news. But as long as they produce evidence to show that, and that's the heart of all journalism is evidence.
They are evidence-based.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have two very quick questions. One of them is to the pair about comics.
Oh, good.
Thankfully, some questions for us.
I'm struck particularly by the first one that you showed of how similar it is to the Western comics look. And I wanted you to comment on the fact of how difficult it is to come up with new visions, new ideas. It's a great idea to have a veiled woman be a superhero, but isn't that just mirroring an old path, coming up with sort of a new story, but an old trope? So that's one question. And then the other is, I really feel as though there is, I don't know what I would call it, but a problem of liberty in the newspapers and media of the West. You have both pointed out where the New York Times has failed, where I see that during Brexit and during the current campaign in the US, the whole idea of what this media is supposed to serve as a fourth estate has failed miserably. So I put that out.
Well,
okay, let's have this question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the comment.
Okay, you're asking. No, come on.
You have a problem. You have a problem with Mike.
You're cursed, I think, isn't it?
Try that.
This is not happening. Okay, you were asking about the comic about Qahira, right? The last.
I'm talking about both. Kind of the first one that you talked about.
Yes, Qahira. Okay, the first thing I know that some people would say like it's not very original for the comic artist to portray this idea of a superheroine who is wearing the hijab, and the fact that she can fight for herself, and this is like a repetitive idea to present again. But the thing is, what she says is that Qahira is a superhero not because she wears the hijab, because she decides to wear what kind of dress that she wants to make.
I'm talking about the difficulty of coming up with a new set of ideas, a new set of images, a new set of... Those are the renderings that come from the West.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of a superhero is an American idea. It's not an Egyptian idea.
I know. But I have to tell you that, like, yes, her idea is based like on American genre of comics. But like back home in Egypt, there is another comic, but it doesn't talk about gender-related issues or stuff about the veil. There is another one called Tuk Tuk, and Tuk Tuk is a very, very, very prominent and popular comic magazine that comes out every 3 months. And this comic, it actually came, people would assume that it came after the 2011 Egyptian revolution, but this is not true, because the comic was actually being printed like 1 year before it. So it came during the time of Mubarak, the Mubarak regime. In this comic, it discusses a lot of things that goes inside Egyptian society, and they are not doing comics that are based on the American style or the Japanese manga or the bande dessinée of the French way of doing it. What they are doing is that they are developing their own techniques of comic drawings and comic techniques, and sometimes they mix them both. So it depends. Yes, of course. Just let me finish. Yes. So it depends which comics, because back home we have comics that are translated from different languages. We have comics that are being originally Egyptian and written in Egyptian language, even like colloquial Egyptian language, not official Arabic language. And there are the official Arabic ones as well. So it depends what kind of selection and what kind of things that you do and present. But this time I didn't have time to present this Tuk Tuk thing. And I leave the floor to Jasmin because she really wants to say something.
And could you just...
Yes, we'll be very, very quick. I think that what you're referring to is the idea that we're using an American tool to express our own values. But this is the only way that we find to communicate with the West, because it's the only way they could understand. We try to reach out to the other civilization with their own means and their own tools in order for them to approach us with caution. You know, you see what I mean? I mean, if we try and publish something in our own style or our own language, I think that half of the world wouldn't understand it. And I totally understand in Western comics, DC and Marvel, there was this superheroine called Dust. A superpower has sand, very original. She was wearing a burqa, and then at the end she was saved by a white male, a white American male.
And this is basically what Naif Mutawara said for his comic for the 99. I wanted to make something that is similar to the West, so that they would at least give us a chance to understand what do we mean.
Okay, just 2 minutes. So we'll do the other question.
Oh yes. What was the question about the chemical weapons? Was that what you're talking about?
No.
Oh yeah, no. You said sorry, the election and how the West has failed miserably. I think that's far too sweeping a generalisation. I really do. I think, you know, as I say, fortunately in America and the UK, we do have a wide spectrum of media. You know, you don't have to watch Fox, you don't have to read the Daily Mail. You know, there are lots of alternatives. And I think just to dismiss it all as having failed miserably, I can't accept that, because I read a lot of media, and I think a lot of the coverage has been digging down into Trump, digging down into Hillary. I think, you know, I think the coverage has been good, and at least, you know, don't forget, we have a proper democratic process going on here. We have, you know, people in power, people who want power, being subject to rigorous scrutiny, so that, again, the voters know what they're getting. You know, and we know the politicians spin, and never have they spun more shamefully than over the Iraq War. You know, the false intelligence about Saddam's weapons was, you know, one of the most shameful episodes in recent American, and I include Britain, British political history, because it was a lie. Now, the media, if you're given, you know, sort of stuff from intelligence sources, how do you handle it? It's a difficult one. Maybe it should have been.
Okay, could we
it
leave
should have
the
been more skeptical, you know, and presented as a claim alleged. But the governments turned it into, you know, you saw Alistair Campbell do it in this country, turned it into intelligence is absolutely 100%. He has chemical weapons.
Okay,
yeah.
David. Now, finally, there will be one question. We may not answer it, but at least let's let's hear the question. Yeah, you.
Sorry, can I address Professor Thussu and Mr. Harrison? If we talk about professionalism in journalism and so on, and we've talked about stereotyping, etc., but the problem I have, particularly since 9/11, is this association of a criminal act with religion. So if a rape, or I think you touched on it, Professor Thussu, or any other criminal act is done by an individual, if he's a non-Muslim, his religion doesn't come into play. But whereas if he's a Muslim, then the headlines and so on. So where is the professionalism in that? And why is this double standards?
Well, I think, again, I come back to the point that not all papers do that. You know, some of the tabloids are far more guilty of it than the broadsheets, for example, are much more responsible about these things. I think a lot of it is about people who are decided that, you know, because this was a terrorist act that was carried out by Muslims in the name of Islam, therefore Islam equals terrorist equals Muslim. I mean, it's just awful. I totally agree. I think it's absolutely outrageous, this conflation of those different elements.
Yeah.
I think, fortunately, not. You know, I agree. It is a problem, and it has to be combated. And I think there is some work going on to do that. We're not there yet. I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just add a couple of sentences to that and disagree with my panelists? It's not since 9/11. It's a much older history, which goes back to you know, Crusades. But let's not go that far back. I'll just remind you. I think it's relevant because we're in Aga Khan University, which has its origin in Pakistan. Aga Khan has. So when Pakistan had its nuclear program starting after the Indian one, it was not unusual to see in mainstream, respectable, proper professional media organization to be described Pakistan's nuclear program as an Islamic bomb. Now, I've never heard that in relation to India or South Africa or Israel or America or, you know, nuclear bombs and nuclear bombs got nothing to do with religion. But just do a Google sometime, do Islamic bomb and see what you get. That makes my point. Thank you.
I wasn't suggesting it began at 9/11. I was simply saying that it did intensify without question.
No, but it's a political position. You politicize a particular religion. It's got nothing to do with the bombs.
Ladies and gentlemen, we should have been at this point at 12:30. Then it would have been wonderful. Now, thank you so much. You've been very patient, and I think the panelists, all of you, all four of them.
Thank you.